Well, it looks like the rumor mill for Warhammer The Old World is a-churning, and you can get ahead of it, well, assuming it's correct, of course, with just a little bit of Blender magic. Now, this is probably the simplest Blender tutorial I've ever done on this channel. It is really that dirt simple, and if you've never used Blender before, you can probably figure it out. Of course, the rumor I'm talking about is that for Warhammer The Old World, all your old bases are going to need to be a little bit bigger. Now you can go ahead and remove the bases from all your old 100 or so miniatures, because that's a lot of fun. Rebase them, repaint them, all that fun stuff with whatever new things Games Workshop offers. Or you can go ahead, load up Blender, and in a few minutes create a little base insert type thing like this, where the miniature sits in it. And now it's the right size for playing Warhammer The Old World. Assuming those rumors are all correct, of course. I'm going to start by diving right into Blender 3.4 right here, but any modern version will work for this tutorial. Now I'm also using a computer that has a mouse as well as a full keyboard, which includes the numpad. If you don't have a numpad, there are ways to work around that, but that's a little bit beyond the scope of this tutorial. So let's do a quick review of the interface of Blender. You can use the mouse wheel to zoom your camera in and out, just like this. If you hold down the mouse wheel button, or the mouse wheel itself like this, and move the mouse around, you can rotate around your view. If you hold down Shift, as well as the mouse wheel, you can pan your view around. And the reason the numpad is kind of important here is you can press the numbers on the numpad to jump to different views. So number 1 will take you to the front view, number 3 the right side view, and number 7 that'll jump you up to the top view. So let's get started with some modeling. Press the letter A to select everything, then press X to delete everything. All that default stuff, we don't need it for our project. I want to start off by adding in what's going to become the actual base itself. Start by holding down Shift A, and then in the menu that pops up, choose Mesh and then Cube. In the lower left hand corner, you're going to see a little button looking thing that says Add Cube. You want to expand that by clicking on it. And for the size, I want to type 30. Now, one note here is that in Blender by default, all the measurements are in meters. However, when you export this thing out into an STL format for your 3D printer, the Blender meters will become real-world millimeters. It's a little confusing, but that's how things work. You now probably have some gigantic cube in front of you here. Yep, that's about right. What I want to do, though, is even though the final base for the Lizardmen is going to be 30 millimeters by 30 millimeters, based on the rumors, of course, I want to make the thickness be a lot thinner, only about 6 millimeters tall. So if you press the letter N on your keyboard, it should bring up a kind of display over here on the right-hand side of the screen that has a bunch of details about what you're working with. Make sure the Item tab is selected. And then under Dimensions, we have X, Y, and Z. X and Y are kind of the length and width of the element. And then Z is going to be the height of the object. So let's click on Z and replace the 30 with 6, or 6 millimeters, which is about 1/4 of an inch. I'm actually going to go ahead with 5 millimeters, make it just a little bit thinner. And the last thing I want to do is name this object as the base, so I know that's what it is. Over on the right-hand side of the screen, you have a whole bunch of more control buttons. There's a lot of those in Blender. Fortunately, most of them we don't got to worry about. But you want to select the object properties, which is a little orange square surrounded by 4 little angled brackets. So click on that if it's not already selected. And then at the top, you can see where it says cube in this text field. That is the name of the object. I want to change this to something that makes a little bit more sense. So 30 millimeter base. Our next step is going to be to cut out the area where the smaller base for the miniature is going to sit. Now I did some measuring, and it would appear that a 25 millimeter base by Games Workshop is a little bit smaller than 25 millimeters. It's like 24.7, 24.9, somewhere in that region. It's important to note that 3D printers are not perfectly accurate. They're very close, but within like say a millimeter or so. Therefore, what I find is that when you're cutting out a hole inside an object for 3D printing, that hole has got to be a little bit bigger than the actual size it needs to be. So even though we may want to try to cut out about a 25 millimeter square out of this base, because of 3D printing, it's got to be bigger than that. Exactly how much bigger really depends on your setup, and there may be some trial and error here for these steps for your printing setup. What I found with my Ultimaker and a relatively slow print speed, it's about 1 millimeter larger than what it needs to be. So what I'm going to actually do is cut out about a 26 millimeter by 26 millimeter hole in the base, and that should be able to accommodate the 25 millimeter Games Workshop bases pretty well. To do that, we kind of have to think in a bit of an inverted fashion. We're going to model a cube that takes up the area that we're going to remove from this base. So hold down Shift and A, and we're going to add another cube just like we did before. This time though, for the size, I'm going to set it to 26. Now once again, you may have to make this a little bit smaller or a little bit bigger, and you can always make this decimal value. So if you want to make this like 26.5 or 25.7, you can do that. But I'm going to start with 26 because I know that works, but there may be some adjustment on your end as you test out these bases and figure out what the exact size needs to be for your printer setup. At the moment here though, the base that we're going to cut out kind of goes through the entire thing. I don't really want to do that. What I need is that a Games Workshop base is approximately 3 millimeters thick. So I just want to cut down 3 millimeters into the top of the base and leave a little bit of material down here to hold the entire base together as one piece. Here's how I'm going to solve that problem. I'm going to jump to the front view. So let's press 1 on the numpad to go there. I'm going to press Z and then choose wireframe. And now you can see I can basically see through the objects. This is going to be helpful here in just a moment. I'm going to press G, which allows me to move an object around in Blender, but then I'm going to press Z, which constrains the movement to one of the axes. In this case, it constrains the movement to the Z axis, or just up and down like you see here. I can't move the object left or right anymore. And because I want to cut out a 3 millimeter deep hole into the base I'm working on, I want to place the bottom of the cube that I have selected right now about 3 millimeters from the top of the base object. In the background here, you got a whole grid of little light gray squares. Each one of those light gray squares is about 1 millimeter. So we can kind of eyeball 3 pretty easily from the top. 1, 2, 3 is right around there. Maybe give it a little bit extra depth, so maybe like 3.2 or something. Then left click on the mouse to put it in place. And if I hold down Z and jump back to solid, you can see now the object's kind of resting in the base instead of being intersecting all the way through it. I'm going to then change the name of this cube to something else, so make sure I have my object properties selected. I'm going to call this cutout. That way I know this is the object I'm going to be cutting out of the other base. Now let's go ahead and actually perform the cutout operation. So I'm selecting my base, and I'm going to use what's called a modifier. As the name suggests, a modifier is basically a mathematical operation that allows you to modify a mesh or do something different with it. The modifier properties is this little blue wrench over here in the right hand set of icons. So I'm going to choose that. And then for the modifier, I want to click on the add modifier button. Under the generate column, choose Boolean. Boolean is a mathematical operation that lets you add or subtract objects from one another. What I want to do here is take the volume of the cutout cube and remove the overlapping areas from the base. So for the object box over here, let's click on that, choose cutout, and you can't tell much has happened right at the moment, but if I press Z, go back to wireframe, you can see now it looks like there's a little bit of some 3D something going on there, because you can see there's a little bit of an orange line in these 4 corners, and what has happened is it has done that mathematical operation. And you can kind of get the idea that it's happened, like I said, because there's some extra lines now floating around in there. What we need to do is apply this modifier. So if you look across from Boolean, go over to the right a few icons. There's a downward facing caret. Click on that and then choose apply. I then want to return to solid mode. So Z, choose solid. Then let's click on our cutout object. We're done with this for now. I can press H to hide it, and that just makes it disappear. And you can see now that our base has a little bit of a cutout to it. The last step here to make it look like it's an actual Warhammer base is that GW bases angle in a little bit, so they're more trapezoids than just pure rectangles. So let's click on our base again, and I'm going to press Tab to go into what's called edit mode. I now have full control over all the vertices of the object, and I can do some really weird stuff if I wanted to. Don't do that, but you know, it's an option there. Each of these little black dots here is a vertex of the mesh, and a vertex is mathematically one of the key core components to a 3D object. So I want to select the 4 top corner vertices. So I click on one, it turns orange, hold down shift, click on the next one, keep shift being held down, and then click on the last 2. And then I've got those 4 selected, and you can see that the edges that connect them are also selected. Let me jump to either the front or side view. So that is either 1 or 3 on your numpad, depending on which one you want to use. It doesn't matter in this case. And most GW bases, the top is about 2 millimeters narrower than the bottom. So I'm going to press S for scale, and I'm going to move the mouse cursor to the left a little bit. And you can notice that the top vertices are moving inwards towards each other. If you remember just a little bit ago, I mentioned that the grid in the background there are 1 millimeter squares. So if I shrink down the top so that it's about 1 millimeter in either direction from the bottom vertice, you can see here, here's the bottom vertices lined up here. The top vertice is now lined up 1 millimeter in, and it's the same way over here. That should result in a top which is about 2 millimeters narrower than the bottom. Let me just kind of back out here, look around, and that's exactly what you see. Okay, we're going to press Tab to jump out back into object mode. Just kind of do one quick little look over. Everything looks all right. And there's one last little magic background math thing that we need to do. Press Tab to go back into edit mode. Press A. This selects all the vertices. Everything is orange. And then Shift and N. You've done something called recalculate normals. You're not going to notice anything. Almost sometimes you might, but more often than not, you won't notice anything. But this is a background mathematical operation that's going to make the export process for 3D printing go a little bit better. It's a magical thing. Just always get in the habit of doing that before you export something into STL format. It avoids certain errors. Now we're going to export it as an STL file so you can send it over to whatever slicer program you like to use for your 3D printer. You want to left click on the object and make sure it's selected so it's glowing in orange like that. We're going to go to File, Export, choose STL. Then you're going to have your little dialog box where you can choose where you want to save it. The important thing is to choose the option Selection Only. If you don't select that, it's going to export everything in your Blender file, which you almost never want to do. Selection Only, as the name implies, is only going to export whatever object you have currently selected. All right, choose Export STL, and at that point, you're ready to go. Open up whatever slicer you run, bring in this STL file as you normally would, and send it off to your 3D printer. And there you go. That's all that's involved with creating your own base size, increaser, upper, I don't know what type to call these things, but you know what they do. They take a smaller base and make it into a larger base. If you've got miniatures for Age of Sigmar and you're looking to convert those over for use with Warhammer the Old World, you can follow the exact same tutorial I got right here. And for the circle bases, you can use a cylinder instead of just using a cube for the cutout shape. The one thing to note there is that cylinders, in addition to having a dimension, in this case radius, they also have a vertex count for basically how many points are going to be used to approximate the shape of the circle. And you want to crank that number up quite a bit, probably like 128. That way the cutout in real life will be pretty close to an actual circle. If you've got oval base miniatures, that gets a little bit trickier. There's not a primitive in Blender that's an exact match to Games Workshop's oval-shaped bases. But a few years ago, I did a tutorial on creating an oval-shaped base for Adeptus Titanicus, and at the very beginning of that tutorial, I show you how you can create the proper oval-shaped base inside of Blender, and you can use that object for the cutout object for your custom bases here for Warhammer the Old World. And then if you want to get adventurous and kind of practice your skills a little bit on your own, you can then go up to creating full-size movement trays. This right here is obviously for a 30mm by 30mm 5x5 rank and file base, but it's got the proper cutouts here for, you know, old school 25mm Warhammer fantasy miniatures. Okay, I think that's about all I have for you today. I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield. If you like some more Blender stuff, I'll be doing a lot of that coming up here in the not too distant future. And I've got these guys just about ready to launch here, hopefully in a few weeks for real. I've been promising them for a while. If you want some more 3D printable kind of sci-fi military vehicles, look for more information on that soon. Until next time, thanks for watching.